Hi, Kerry Grinkmeyer here on Best of Us Investors. As the thumbnail said, currently in the United States, there are 5.8 million people with Alzheimer's over the age of 65, and that number is going to increase to 7.1 million in 2025. Now, we know that Biogen came out with a drug that had some mixed reviews, but there are other companies who recognize the potential here and the investment opportunity that it could hold for you. To give you some reference point, right now it's projected that there will be 1.4 million electric vehicles sold in the United States by 2025. Let me go back to the number of 7.1 million Americans with Alzheimer's at the same time. 1.4 million cars, 7.1 million people. Where's the best investment opportunity here? You tell me. Which is more important? You tell me. If you have a family member who has Alzheimer's, I think you know the answer to that question. So that's why Jacob is very interested in talking to the head science officer from Immune Bio. He started by giving you a deep dive into why it was important and why he thought you should take a look at it, then interviewed the head scientist, and now he's going to do today an interview with Dr. R.J. Tesi, who is the CEO and co-founder of Immune Bio. I think it's interesting to me that there is so much fervor around electric vehicles, and it's about a car. It's about a car. It's not like it's your life. If you've ever experienced the demise of an individual with dementia or Alzheimer's, you know there's no comparison. And I want you to contemplate what these people are working on and how, with the advent of artificial intelligence and machine learning, how this is going to happen. And if you want to make an investment, this is where you should spend some time. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't buy Immune Bio, but I'm saying you need to know about it, and you need to learn about it, and you need to make a decision. The other thing I want to share with you and make sure that you understand is we do not get paid, and we will not accept payment for doing videos like this. I have been accused, Jacob was accused, of doing a pump and dump. No, that's not what we're all about. We're about bringing you good investment information. We're not about taking advantage of you, as I am accused of that. I watch Bloomberg's and I watch Squawk Box and CNBC, and I'm wondering, do you believe those people who are come on there are being paid? Or CNBC is being paid for pumping and dumping? I don't know. You tell me. Okay. This is an interesting video. Dr. R.J. Tesi is a very interesting man. He's not too conscious of camera ethics or camera etiquette, but I think you'll find this informative. Listen to it. It's a long video, but you'll come away with some knowledge that you didn't have before. And that's what this channel is all about. But again, I want you to focus on the numbers. There will be 1.4 million electric vehicles sold in the United States by 2025. There'll be 7.1 million people in the United States that are suffering from Alzheimer's in the same span. Where do you want to invest? Enjoy this, and that's what this channel is all about. Helping you, not telling you what to buy, but where to look. let's get this financial advice situation cleared up, and then we'll talk to Dr. R.J. Tessie and Jacob.
Best of Us Investors presents Carrie Griegmeyer. Hello, everyone. I hope you, thank you for coming to this video. I hope you had the opportunity to check out our previous 2 videos with Immune Bio. The first one was that background video that went up on Monday. And then the second one was the video with Professor Dr. Lodell about specifically the oncology drug that Immune Bio does. Today, we have a real pleasure. We're going to be talking with the CEO of Immune Bio, Dr. Tessie. Real quick, I'm going to let him introduce himself before we get started.
Thank you, Jacob. I am the CEO, one of the founders and chief medical officer of Immune Bio. I'm a clinician. Earlier in my career, I was an academic transplant surgeon, but have been in biotech for 20 plus years, always involved in immunology and inflammation. Neuroinflammation is really an immunologic response. And I think one of the things that makes Immune Bio unique is that we view many neurologic diseases as an immunologic disease. That is, if you fix the immune system, you can tackle these diseases.
Okay, thank you for that. So my first question is kind of more about just a general idea of the research process. So you've shown some impressive data in neuroinflammation, which is a hallmark of AD, and then downstream effects with neurodegeneration seem to follow from that neuroinflammation. So from your clinical trial design, it seems that you planned a process to test one and then the other. Was this purely based on the data you saw in animals? And and based on the present results you have you needed to reassess your plan or change it at all for XPro?
Yeah, thank you very much. So yes, we planned for these effects. And let me go into that a little more deeply because it's really a kind of a primer on drug development. All drug developers hope that their animal data translates into man. And in our case with XPro for treatment of neuroinflammation, that translation was actually quite remarkable. But ultimately, a phase 1 trial has really 4 goals. That is that you need to really do a number of things. And that includes show that it's safe, show that it works, and understand how to make the next steps. So we'll talk more about that based on another question. But clearly, our clinical studies had to show that we decreased neuroinflammation, and we did that. But in the modern era of drug development, just proving that a drug is safe and undergoes what we call target engagement, in our case, neuroinflammation, isn't really enough to get investors and even board of directors willing to commit to the next step. You have to show that so-called target engagement is actually having a benefit to the disease. So when you look at dementia, then after neuroinflammation, the 2 things you need to fix are nerve cell death and synaptic function. So we had to design in measures of neurodegeneration and synaptic function into our clinical trials. And we did that using a combination of CNS analytics, CSF, cerebral spinal fluid analytics, and analytics using MRI with white and gray matter. And as you know, we've talked about these biomarkers have turned out to be extremely powerful, extremely illuminating into what's going into the brain, what's going on in the brain when you treat the patient with XPro. Now, the second part of that is the phase 1 trial has to give you insight into how to design the phase 2 trial. And we were able to do that with all the information that we learned. We learned what our biomarkers for inclusion should be and what our biomarkers for response should be. And these biomarkers that we've chosen them to be practical. In other words, we don't want to measure something that's really complicated, because when you get to the real world of trying to execute both phase 3 trials and commercialization, if you make it too difficult, the patients or the clinicians don't use the drug. So yes, we planned for success. I will be honest that our success has been much greater than expected, because you never expect a drug to really translate perfectly from animals to man. And in this case, XPro did.
Yeah, that's really cool. So you mentioned biomarkers, and I actually had a question about biomarkers. So I've seen a few different drug trials, and I noticed you guys report two biomarkers I don't really see. That's VILIP-1 and contactin. So my question is, why do you report these biomarkers when many companies do not? And is there any biomarker test that you mentioned previously that you released that you consider particularly telling or important?
So yeah, thank you. I mean, we believe biomarker, particularly for phase 1, where you can't really or shouldn't be doing an efficacy trial. It's all about biomarkers. You need to have clues that your drug is working. Now, the other goal of phase 1 is a little bit exploratory to find out, what can help you down the line. Now, one of the biomarker sets that we have is proteomic data from the CSF. Proteome basically looks at the types of proteins that are in the CSF, which is a surrogate of what's happening in the brain before treatment and 3 months later. It's a very valuable biofluid. It's a little bit of a pain to get. And, so the two biomarkers that you talk about, VILIP-1 and contactin, and I'll come back to those, were really, shall we say, they weren't prospective biomarkers as much as they were biomarkers that kind of fell out of the analysis, but they're consistent with everything we're trying to do. VILIP-1 is a biomarker of neurodegeneration. So it's very similar to looking at neurofilament or tau, in our case, phosphorylated tau 217. So VILIP-1 going down dramatically means there are fewer nerve cells dying. And that's exactly one of the things you need to do in the treatment of dementia. You have to stabilize and prevent further nerve cell death. And what we have done in our trial is we always look at this biology from multiple directions. So if only VILIP-1 went down and p-tau or neurofilament didn't go down, we'd be suspicious. But the fact that VILIP-1, neurofilament, and phospho-tau 217 all went down gives us great confidence that, in fact, we have stopped nerve cell death. The second one, connectin, is really a biomarker of neurite formation. So, what happens, and this was really confirmed by some of the white matter analytics that we did, what we were, quite frankly, shocked and surprised to find is the brain of these elderly patients actually start to repair themselves. They begin to remodel. And to remodel, the nerve cells have to send out new projections to connect to other nerve cells. And that's called synaptic plasticity, and it's part of the synaptic repair part. That's the second brick in the wall that's a must for curing or treating dementia. So these are two biomarkers that are consistent with the primary goals of our therapeutic approach. That primary goal is that when you get rid of neurodegeneration, neuroinflammation, you stop nerve cell death and you promote synaptic function. And those three things should improve the cognition of the patient.
Yeah. So kind of back on biomarkers. So kind of a two-part question. It seemed like in the past, cognition was kind of what a drug was approved on. And to my knowledge, you guys haven't really done too much with cognition. So I kind of was wondering, what is your plan with cognition? You mentioned that you think it will help. So do you plan to start testing for this in your later trials and release it? And then also with Biogen's recent drug approval, do you think the FDA has kind of changed standards to be based their approvals more on biomarkers than cognition?
Yeah, thank you. So I think thank you for asking this question, because I've been baffled by some of this criticism that we haven't gotten cognition out of a phase 1 trial. Phase 1 trial is not an efficacy trial. And particularly in neurologic diseases, every efficacy trial needs a placebo control group because there are large placebo effects in many of these diseases. And in fact, that means that you end up having to have very large trials or larger trials going for a longer time. That's not the role of a phase 1 trial. I already told you that there are 4 goals of a phase 1 trial: establish safety, establish target engagement, establish what dose to take to phase 2, and demonstrate those downstream benefits. And we did that in the phase 1. There are a couple anecdotes of improved cognition, but the trial wasn't designed to measure cognition because there's no placebo group, which is the standard in phase 1. And in fact, every one of these other companies did a phase 1 trial. It just hasn't been the focus of many investors. So yes, we are very focused on cognition because we recognize that at the end of the day, the rubber meets the road when you develop drugs for dementia and what effects you have on cognition in the patients. People don't care if their neuroinflammation goes down if it doesn't affect cognition. People don't care if you have synaptic improvement or improved synaptic function if that doesn't translate to changes in cognition. So the phase 2 trials, the primary endpoints are cognitive endpoints. We will report them. We're quite confident that we're going to see good results. So we're going to be shouting from them for the rooftop. I will say that one of the amusing problems we have is everybody wants us to have cognitive endpoints. So we've designed blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled trials. And then everybody says they want to see a snapshot of the data halfway through the trial. And that's something that you can't do both. You can't have a blinded trial and get a peek at the data. You have to wait till the trials are fully enrolled. So in fact, we'll be reporting our cognition data in 2023 from both of these trials. And it, should demonstrate everything I've talked about before, that when you decrease neuroinflammation, those downstream benefits translate into changes in cognition. So now let's talk about the FDA, the second question. So, it's been interesting as a longtime drug developer watching this, debate that's been occurring both by clinicians, by the press, and by the regulators about the Biogen drug. First of all, it worked. Second of all, since there's no other drug, it's safer than anything else that's out there. It's not a perfect drug, but the first drug approved in any indication is never perfect. Now, people have confused the fact that the FDA was very focused on its ability to decrease amyloid with the fact that they're saying it didn't improve cognition. And that's not true at all. All patient groups, no matter which trial you look at, that got full dose, i.e. the high dose drug, had improvements in cognition compared to, or had, it had slower decline in cognition compared to control patients. So the drug worked. The drug is hard to use. There are some safety problems, and there will be better drugs, but the drug works. Do I think the FDA is just going to approve a drug, like, say, for instance, like Expro, just on the fact that we get decreased neuroinflammation, or we improve apparent fiber density without any evidence that we improve cognition? No. We have to demonstrate in a well-designed, blinded, randomized trial that we actually have an impact on cognition. Now, the accelerated approval may come from the fact that they don't make us do 2 pivotal trials. Maybe we only have to do 1. But the bottom line is they're not going to approve a drug for treating a disease where cognition is the problem if it doesn't improve cognition, if it doesn't make a difference in cognition. So, yeah, I think the FDA is slowly coming around to the concept of biomarkers and importance in CNS, but no, they're just not going to give you a pass based on improving a biomarker until it's validated, and that's a whole different can of worms.
For sure. Yeah, I think that was That was very informative. So I noticed you added another trial to your phase twos, and that was the phase two MCI trial. Would you be able to comment on this any further?
Think so MCI and mild AD are part of a continuum, right? But it's very unusual in my part for drug development to occur in diseases in the worst of patients and better patients. I mean, look at how they do cancer drug development. They don't treat patients with stage 1 disease in the same clinical trial as they treat patients in stage 3 and 4 disease, right? There's a reason for that, because those patients have a different arc of progression of the disease. And that's exactly the same in MCI and mild AD. You know, patients who have mild AD have a fairly well described decline. They're on the ski slope and they're going downhill, right? Patients with MCI, only 10% of those patients per year progress to Alzheimer's disease. So a majority of patients are either stable or get better, i.e., there are patients with MCI one year who don't have MCI next year because the disease fluctuates, right? How do you do a clinical trial when only 10% of the people are getting worse? That's really, really hard. So we've separated them, use a little bit different trial design with some different biomarkers, because at the end of the day, we think that, you know, the mild AD is easy because we know the patients are on the decline. The MCI trials are a little bit more challenging, we believe, from a design point of view, but we believe it's an easier disease to treat. And what do I mean by that? That continuum that goes from MCI to mild to moderate to severe disease is a continuum that goes from a disease that's primarily, and this is R.J. Tessie's opinion, and let's be clear about that, goes from a disease that is primarily synaptic dysfunction with MCI to a disease that, with, let's say, moderate Alzheimer's disease, is a combination of synaptic dysfunction and nerve cell death, neurodegeneration, to when you get to severe disease where there's been so much neurodegeneration, no matter how much synaptic rehabilitation you do, there's nothing to rehabilitate. So we are focused on those stages of disease where we think it's easy to fix, which is when there's primarily synaptic dysfunction. And those are the MCI and the mild. But the bottom line is, in our opinion, we think people are making a mistake lumping them together in the same clinical trial because it makes it difficult to treat two diseases in the same trial.
Speaking on your phase two trials, do you intend to offer an open label extension afterwards if you have positive results?
Yeah, both trials are actually designed that way. And when I say an open label, there's a little caveat there because it's also a crossover. So the patients, remember, they're being blinded and randomized. So at the end of the trial, you break the code, so to speak. And those that have been on placebo will now be offered Expro. Okay. So, you know, whereas before, you know, for instance, in the mild trial, for every three patients enrolled, two get Expro and one gets placebo. After 6 months, they're all on Expro, and we'll follow those patients longer. So we really get two pieces of information out of that extension trial. One is it provides us long-term safety and efficacy data, which is a critical part of the FDA evaluation. And the second thing, it allows us, quote, a crossover, where we should show that the patients who were on placebo received no benefits from treatment. And when they're switched over to Expro, they actually receive a benefit. So that happens in both trials, both in the MCI and the Expro. And there's actually a couple other reasons for this. It's a bit of an inducement for patients to join the trial. I mean, you know, if you say you're going to treat them for 3 months or 6 months, some may say, well, if I go into one of these other trials, I can get drug for 18 months. And we're like, yeah, but you might get placebo for 18 months. And this way, we encourage patients that a decision is made quickly, whether they're benefiting from the drug, and they can be under treatment instead of waiting 18 months of getting worse before they know whether they've been on placebo or active drug.
So this year you had a trial called the Queller program where you used XPro in COVID-19 patients. You ended the trial and you mentioned why on the conference call, but you treated many people with XPro. Is any of the data you obtained from this trial useful going forward in your other trials?
So there's always safety data, which is useful, but the indication we were treating, which was really a cytokine release syndrome, which is what acute COVID was for patients who are hospitalized, has limited use, we believe. I mean, there are some cancer applications, but it's really not where we want to focus. I think what's more interesting is that, is there any role for a drug like XPro in treatment of patients who receive COVID-19? We believe that, with the, if people are, reasonable about getting vaccinations, and for those that break through after vaccination, now that there are oral agents for COVID, that we think the most severe patients, at least those who are going to require ICU, it just doesn't happen anymore. The only people in the ICUs are people that haven't gotten vaccinated. But there is a reservoir of patients who develop neurologic complications as part of long COVID. And there's some evolving data that these neurologic complications may be due to neuroinflammation. We've thought this for a while. We even talked to the FDA and discussed actually doing a clinical trial on patients with neuroinflammation and COVID-19. This was about a year ago, and they at that time they said they couldn't support it because they didn't know what long COVID was. They couldn't hang a set of diagnoses on it. So we're waiting. I mean, at some point, the NIH and the FDA are going to say, "Hey, we got a problem here, and we think it's neuroinflammation. Can you help?" And when they come around to the belief that neuroinflammation is part of the disease, that we may talk about it again. But right now, we watch from the sidelines. We think neuroinflammation plays an important role, but we are waiting until all of the powers that be, the NIH and the FDA, agree with us. And at that point, we may decide to, wade into the fray, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like a good approach. Since Immune Bio takes a novel approach to AD, an approach that many companies haven't even really looked at, do you see a combination therapy with XPro and another safe drug, for example, an amyloid removing drug in the future?
Yeah, so we like combination therapy, especially for those with moderate disease and beyond. There's a couple of actual roles for XPro in these anti-amyloid therapies. Remember the safety complication with the anti-amyloid therapies, and this is whether you're talking about the Biogen product, whether you're talking about the Roche product or the Lilly product, is ARIA, which is neuroinflammation, right? By the way, we have a drug that treats neuroinflammation, so it makes a lot of sense to combine the two just to improve the safety. What most people don't realize is that when you get the Biogen drug, it takes you 10 months to get to full dose, and you don't have a clinical effect until you're at full dose. And the reason it takes you 10 months to get to full dose is because they're afraid of ARIA, right? So basically, the patient is progressing for 10 months until they get to a therapeutic, that's a year, until you get to a therapeutically effective dose. Potentially, and I would say this is a hypothesis, if you have a way to prevent neuroinflammation, you could get to full dose more quickly. Let's say you could do it in 3 months. That's going to make a difference in the patient's outcome, no question about that. The third reason to do them together is, the hallmark of combination therapy in medicine, which is common, is you take two drugs with different mechanism of actions and you combine them and hope there's synergy. That is, the sum of the parts is greater than each alone. So 1 + 1 = 4. We think, because amyloid, although it plays, we think, a peripheral role, it does play a role, clearly. If you get rid of amyloid and you combine it with an anti-inflammatory strategy with XPro, and notice I say with XPro because I'm not willing to predict that any other anti-inflammatory strategies have the same kind of effects that we do. If you combine it with XPro, I think it would be a pretty good therapy, but at the end of the day, you got to do the clinical trial, and we can't do those clinical trials without the help of one of those companies. So we sit by the phone and hope they call.
So I was looking at your TRD trials, and I noticed that they were over 6 weeks, and obviously this is a very fast trial. So what do you hope to get out of this trial? If it's so short, and why did you make it so short?
So with the TRD trial, we actually have some clinical data that gives us a model. It turns out Professor Andy Miller, who's down at Emory University, is really the godfather of the role of neuroinflammation in depression and resistant depression. And he's the PI of this study. And he showed a while ago, I think it was in 2011, that there was actually using infliximab, which is the first of the non-selective TNF inhibitors, that if you treated patients with treatment-resistant depression over 6 weeks, they would get better. So we have clinical evidence that 6 weeks is long enough for a clinical effect. And I will emphasize that the primary endpoint, though, once again, is a set of biomarkers that include functional MRI, which is different than what we're using for the Alzheimer's trials. So we're pretty confident that 6 weeks is long enough. And so, it's a matter of, we'll get that trial going once we get the Alzheimer's trials going. So.
You received a $500,000 grant from the NIH for ALS. So the NIH grant process, from my understanding, is incredibly difficult. So congratulations on that. But what are ImmuneBio's plans in regards to this disease?
Yeah, so it actually goes from the ALS Foundation, but they are incredibly hard to get. We like ALS because it's a disease where neuroinflammation and neurodegeneration are a big part of its pathophysiology. The problem is that a lot of companies have died in that ditch, if you know what I mean. I mean, there have been many ALS trials, and they, for the most part, failed. And we believe that it's because people don't understand the disease well enough to enrich. Remember, segment a group of patients that you think you can treat, and the endpoints are primarily clinical. So it's a disease. It's a modern disease using what we will call antiquated strategies for drug development. So we are spending a lot of time trying to better understand how to subset the ALS patients into a group of patients that will benefit from XPro, and then make sure we have the biomarkers to move forward like we've done with Alzheimer's disease, because we just don't want to do what everybody else has done. You're familiar with the famous quote by Einstein that says if I can paraphrase, the definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, right? So we want to do something different. We are committed. We've just hired someone who is an ALS expert, whose main goal is to figure this out for us over the next couple of years. But until we solve the enrollment criteria and the biomarker strategy, I doubt we'll actually initiate a clinical trial. So all I can say is stay tuned.
All right. So some people say that Alzheimer's is developing way before it's ever diagnosed in a patient, up to 10 to 15 years earlier. With XPro seemingly good safety results so far, have you had any thought about testing out XPro, giving it early proactively before a diagnosis for Alzheimer's, for example, down the road in actual real world settings?
Yeah, so we like that strategy, but I mean, first things first. First, we have to prevent the, shall we say, the diseases that are diagnosed. That is MCI and mild. I mean, that's where we're focused. Then don't hold me to this, but I would predict we begin to look earlier, because you're absolutely right. The disease is starting to develop decades before it actually is manifest clinically by forgetfulness and dementia. The problem is, how do you do a trial that you have to enroll a lot of patients and follow for 20 years before you know you have a result? That would be using a clinical endpoint. You can't do that trial. Nobody wants to do that trial. Even the NIH won't do that trial, right? So that's where the biomarkers come in. And that's part of our embrace of biomarkers, is they allow us to answer some of these questions. Once we validate biomarkers of neuroinflammation, for instance, white matter-free water, and let's say of efficacy that correlates with cognition, let's call it apparent fiber density, which is my favorite, may not be the right one. Once we validate those, and by that, there's a formal process for validating biomarkers with the FDA. So it's not a simple task, but it's a task that we are already embracing. Once we validate those, then you can start moving downstream. You can look at someone in their 50s and say, okay, this patient has an elevated CRP. He's, got metabolic syndrome. This is a patient that, let's look and see if he has neuroinflammation. If he does, you can then decide whether he should be tested and treated and followed, and see if you can make a benefit in a fairly short period of time. And that period may be 2 or 3 years. A 2 or 3 year trial you can do, assuming you've got other, revenue streams, but you can't do a 10 or 20 years trial. So we like moving early. There's every disease known to man responds to therapy, the better, the earlier you get it. The same will be for neuroinflammation and dementia. So that's the future, but it has to wait for the present.
Just to end it here, do you have any thoughts on the current broader thoughts on the current market, or final thoughts on immune bio?
Yeah, so I hope you're not talking about the broader stock market, because biotech has again been really under a lot of pressure in the future for the last 6 months. But I'm going to say you're talking about the broader market for neuroinflammation and XPro, and we have a corporate, in our corporate deck is a slide we call the iceberg slide. And the iceberg slide is a slide that basically shows an iceberg, because the tip of the iceberg, the stuff above the waterline, is what you know about. It's Alzheimer's disease, TRD, and ALS. But below the waterline is a long list of diseases that all have neuroinflammation as part of their pathophysiology that we have animal data on. Things like MS, Parkinson's disease, TBI, PTSD, and there are more. Based on how well the animal data translate to man, we expect all those diseases to come above the waterline over the next 3 or 4 years. Okay, it'll take a little bit of time, because obviously we don't have unlimited resources. But the big advantage of XPro over a drug like Biogen's drug, which targets amyloid, if you target amyloid, once you go beyond Alzheimer's disease, there's nothing to treat. When you treat neuroinflammation, Alzheimer's is just the start. And so we're at the beginning of a very interesting journey. That journey will make a difference to patients. It'll make a difference to clinical teams. It'll make a difference to investors who invested in immune bio. And we're pretty excited about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on here today, Dr. Tessie. For anyone watching this video, for more information, watch the previous 2 videos, or check out Immune Bio's website and their corporate slides.
Thank you very much, Jacob. It's a pleasure.